if you cannot see the TV, don't fret, because what's on the TV and what's on the handout are the same thing. If you can't see the handout, I'm sorry, I can't help you. Those of you who are new to the class, we've been talking about the Bible translations that we have in the English language. And we've been talking about some issues related to the translation process itself. We've talked about the original languages of the Bible. We've talked about some issues that arise just in general in the process of translating. We've talked about, in particular, some specific issues that come up dealing with the specific languages that we're dealing with in taking the Old Testament Hebrew and Aramaic and the New Testament Greek over into English, and issues that go along with that. We've also talked about last week some philosophies of translation that have characterized various different English translations of the Bible. Before we get into talking about specific translations and talking about their specific pros and cons and philosophies and things of that nature, I thought it would be worthwhile to you to back up for a moment and let's look at the history of the Bible coming to us in the English language. It's a very interesting history, but I think it's a history that's worth knowing because it sheds an awful lot of light on what we are going to be saying about the specific translations in future sessions of our class. And while I'm on the subject of future sessions of our class, say that 5 times fast. Next week will be our last week in this room for a while. The ladies are going to be having a special series this summer, and they're going to need this room because hopefully they're going to fill it up and overflow it. But those of you who will remain with me, we're going to be moving down to what is at the moment the ladies' classroom right down the hall. So we'll be in there, and the ladies will be in here. And ladies, if you decide to abandon me, no hard feelings. I'd rather look at the ladies that y'all are going to have speak to you than look at me anyway. So anyhow, here we are. Let's look at our chart. We have said in previous editions of this class that the New Testament was finished being written probably no later than 100 AD. Actually, probably earlier than that. Probably at the latest sometime in the early 90s. But certainly no later than the end of the 1st century AD. Now, that spans several important developments in the growth of the church. One of them, of course, being the story that we read in Acts chapter 10, where the gospel is taken to the Gentiles, which begins to create a situation where translation is going to be an issue. Now, that's not the first time translation has been an issue. As a matter of fact, translation has been an issue from the very first day that the church has been in existence. Because if you recall, the very thing that allowed the apostles to validate the fact that what they were saying came from God was the fact that they were speaking the gospel in other languages. So that the people who were gathered in Jerusalem, who were Jews, but Jews from every nation under earth, could hear and understand what they were saying. Okay? So translation literally has been an issue from day one. But it especially becomes an issue as the gospel goes in Acts chapter 10 to the household of Cornelius, and then in chapter 11 to the first Gentile church in Antioch, and then in the succeeding chapters of the book of Acts as Paul and Barnabas and others begin to take the gospel to the Gentiles around the Roman Empire, and language barriers and culture barriers become issues in the spread of the gospel. Well, the gospel was subject to persecution from very early on. You remember how the 8th chapter of the book of Acts begins, that Stephen is stoned at the end of chapter 7, and then in chapter 8, in the first few verses, there arises a persecution against the church at Jerusalem, so severe that the disciples are scattered abroad, and they go everywhere preaching the word. That is really the beginning of a strong Jewish persecution against the church that begins sometime after the establishment of the church. It's difficult to pinpoint exactly when Acts 8, 1 through 3 takes place. We couldn't put a year on it exactly. But it's sometime shortly after the establishment of the church, and it continues until 70 AD. Anybody know why it stops in 70 AD? Titus the Roman general comes in and he sacks the city of Jerusalem, he destroys it, and he breaks the back of the Jews as a people. They don't have a national identity, a cultural identity, a religious center or hub anymore from which to persecute the church. As a matter of fact, they're as much religious refugees as the Christians are, if not more so, from 70 onward. Okay? And so the Jewish persecution of the church ends in 70 when the city of Jerusalem falls. The church has a brief period of rest, but it isn't very long until the Romans pick up the persecution. Now, Nero had done some persecuting during his time as Caesar in the 60s AD, but after Nero, it sort of dies down for a while, and then under Vespasian and Domitian in the 80s and 90s, it again picks up strength, and especially under Domitian, it becomes much more widespread, much more official, and very vicious against the church. And that's part of the reason many people date the book of Revelation in the 90s, because they believe the historical backdrop for the writing of the book of Revelation is the Domitian persecution of the church. And that may very well be. But in any case, that would put the Bible being finished being written in the 90s AD. And then for the next several hundred years, couple hundred years, the Romans' official position toward Christianity is an antagonistic position. They are not friendly toward the church. It is not an accepted religion. It is a persecuted religion. It must be practiced more or less underground. And so you have, for several years, the church being persecuted now by the Romans. In 313 AD, that changes. In 313, Constantine is now the Caesar, and Constantine passes the Edict of Milan. Milan. You can tell I'm from West Tennessee, can't you? It's Milan. Siri had it right all along. No, the Edict of Milan, which officially ends Roman persecution of Christianity. Now, those of you who were with me when we studied church history know that by 313, the church that is being no longer persecuted by Constantine bears very little resemblance to the church that was established on the day of Pentecost. It's already grown and mutated and changed in many ways, departing from the scriptures. But at any rate, the Romans stopped persecuting Christianity, which allows Christianity to sort of come out of the shadows, and along with it to bring the Bible out of the shadows, and the process of translating the Bible out of the shadows. And so Bible translating can be done in the open, and it can be done in ways where there are much more official checks and balances on the regularity and the accuracy of the copying, those sorts of things. Okay? There had been by 600 or by 500 AD more than 500 different translations of the New Testament made into different languages. And the New Testament, as I say, had been being translated from very, very early on. But there is a particular translation that was made in 382 that became extremely influential. And that was a translation by Jerome into the Latin language. Jerome made an observation that the New Testament was not written in the high literary Greek. In other words, it's not written in the Greek prose of Plato, Aristotle, of Homer, and the Greek classics. Rather, it is written in what is called Koine Greek, which means common Greek. It was the language of the common man. Following that lead, when Jerome translated the New Testament into Latin, he wanted to translate it into the Latin of the common Latin speaker, and not the very refined literary Latin that existed in his day. And consequently, his translation came to be known as the Latin Vulgate. Now, when you were a child and you were picking your nose or doing something you weren't supposed to do, did your mother ever say to you, "Don't be vulgar"? Do you know what the word vulgar means? It originally means common. ordinary, as opposed to refined and sophisticated. And that's exactly the root word from which the Latin Vulgate gets its name. It was the common ordinary Latin of common ordinary Latin speakers. Problem was, Latin never was especially widespread as a speaking language in the Roman Empire. It was the official language of the Roman government, and that's the language that the business of government was done in. But the ordinary people outside of Italy really didn't speak Latin. But at any rate, that's the Latin that he translated it into. And so it was a fairly common Latin as Latin goes. Well, the Latin Vulgate became highly, highly revered as Christianity changed. As the church grew into what became the Catholic Church. They called it Catholic because it meant worldwide, but it also grew all of the hierarchy that we talked about in previous lessons. It grew these traditions and doctrines that varied from the scriptural pattern, and you had all of these sorts of things that are developing, and the people in the church grow to highly regard Jerome's translation of the Bible. And then when the church splits in two, in, what was it, 1080? Is that right? 1054. 1054, when it splits between East and West, the western part of the church becomes known as the Roman Catholic Church, and they make the Latin Vulgate effectively the official translation of the Roman Catholic Church. The Eastern Schism, the Eastern Division, becomes essentially what we know as the Greek Orthodox Church, and they held very much to Greek language manuscripts of the Bible. I'm trying to keep touching this just to keep my computer from going to sleep. Yes, sir?
Did the Latin Vulgate include the Apocrypha?
Yes, it absolutely did. There's a lot of discussion we could have on that, and maybe we should have a discussion on that. For the moment, I'm going to table that discussion, but yes, to answer your question, the Vulgate did include the Apocrypha. The books and portions of books that are in the Catholic Old Testament, which you will not find in your Old Testament, because frankly, they're not inspired. That's the very, very, very short condensed version, okay? But at any rate, yes, it did. The Latin Vulgate becomes the official translation of the Roman Catholic Church, which the Roman Catholic Church comes to dominate Western Europe. And you know your world history. You know how that the kings and the powers that be in Western Europe for most of the Middle Ages rose or fell largely due to their relationship with the Roman Catholic Church. Along the way, the Latin Vulgate comes to be regarded as the only legitimate version of the Bible. And the idea of taking it from Latin and putting it into vernacular languages, the languages that the people speak, becomes something that is deeply frowned upon by the church. Now, meanwhile, after the fall of Rome, around 400, Europe goes into a period of economic, more or less, crisis. And where the common people in the days when Rome was flourishing generally tended to be relatively well off and literate and things of that nature compared to what happened during the Middle Ages, the common man in the Middle Ages tended to be illiterate and not especially well off and dependent entirely on the church to tell him what the Bible said. Especially because outside of the circle of the church and the university that was developing at that time, nobody spoke Latin. By this time, it's a dead language, except scholars and the church. And so let's say, for example, you are a French peasant, and you go to Mass on Sunday, and you sit down in your pew, and a priest gets up, and he reads the entire Mass in Latin. You understand very little of it. I mean, French ultimately derives from Latin, so maybe you can pick up a word here and there, but you understand very little of it. the idea of reading the Bible is impossible for you. Okay? So the concept of interpreting the Bible into vernacular languages begins to be somewhat of a revolutionary idea. Now, in 1516, there is a scholar by the name of Erasmus who compiles a group of texts that come to be known as the Textus Receptus. Let's talk about that for a moment. Erasmus's main project was not to compile an authoritative Greek text per se. Erasmus's main project actually was to revise and refine the Latin Bible. He observed that the Latin that Jerome translated the Bible into was common ordinary Latin. And he thought it was somewhat of a disgrace that the Bible was written in not very beautiful Latin, when there was this very beautiful literary Latin, that the Latin literature of old had been written in. And he thought, I can take this and I can correct some mistakes that Jerome made, and I can refine the language, and I can produce for the church a much better quality Latin Bible. And that's really what he set out to do. But he also knew that a part of what was going to have to happen in order to give his Bible any degree of credibility was that he was going to have to demonstrate that where he differed from Jerome, he had made better choices about how to translate the original language. And that became especially true in the New Testament, and so he compiles a Greek text that he puts alongside his Latin text so that the scholars who are evaluating his translation into Latin can look at this Greek text and see that this is how he translated this. And at times he put notes in there to say, I translated this differently from Jerome here because X, Y, Z, to explain his translation choices. Okay? So his compiling of the Greek text was really just sort of an adjunct to his work in trying to produce a superior Latin translation. But the text that he compiled became very, very influential in and of itself. Now here's the thing. The text that he compiled effectively comes from about 6 manuscripts that he had access to at the time he was compiling his Greek text. Remember when we talked about the many Greek manuscripts that we have discovered of the New Testament that date back to within a few years of the actual writing? We also talked about the fact that there became what we call families of manuscripts. You remember that? And they were tied specifically to geographical regions. In other words, I have a manuscript of the Bible and I live in Galatia. And I want to make copies of my manuscript so other people can read it. Okay? Well, let's say that my manuscript spells Peter, P-E-T-A-R. This is hypothetical because it wouldn't be English to begin with. But let's just say it spelled it P-E-T-A-R. And all the copies of my manuscript, I spell Peter, P-E-T-A-R. And so as I disseminate copies that are made from my copy, they're all spelled P-E-T-A-R. And years later, when people find the copies of my copy, they can say, hey, we know this came from around Galatia because that's a characteristic divergence from the text. Okay? And so there began to be families of texts that were able to be located to within a certain geographical region. And one of the great things about this is you could use the different families as a check and balance against one another to try to figure out what was the original most likely going to say. Well, of the 6 manuscripts that Erasmus was working from, 5 of them came from the same family. Which means for all intents and purposes, he was really working with, realistically, 2 manuscripts, more or less. That's an oversimplification, but that's essentially the case. He's working with one family and one divergent text, by and large. Okay? He compiles this Textus Receptus, which is good work. It's good scholarship as far as what he had to work with. Remember how difficult it would be in the 1500s to get your hands on this sort of stuff to begin with, to study it and compare and make notes and things of that nature. But the Textus Receptus gains such wide popularity as an adjunct, as an add-in to his Latin Bible, that people began to give high respect to that particular Greek text as being a very high quality rendering of what the original Greek must have been. In fact, it began to be called the Textus Receptus, which is Latin for what? Anybody know?
Received text.
The received text, which sort of sounds like we've received it from on high, doesn't it? But remember, we talked about the transmission process as well as the translation process. We have no reason in Scripture to believe that those are inspired. In other words, the people making copies were not inspired as they make copies, nor are the people translating into foreign languages inspired as they make the translations. The original writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Peter, Paul, James, and Jude, were inspired as they wrote. But the transmitters and the translators were not. Okay? So you have this text. It becomes known as the Textus Receptus, and it gains wide popularity in part because in 1516 there was one very influential invention that has come on the scene, and that's Gutenberg's printing press. And Erasmus's Bible was one of the early and very widely disseminated printed Bibles, and so it gained popularity. The Textus Receptus gained great popularity, and there were some legends that sprung up about the Textus Receptus to the idea that this text was somehow providentially protected by God and was superior to other texts. Well, there's another problem with Erasmus's 6 texts. Aside from the fact that he really only had 2 variants to look at, one family and one that was outside the family, the oldest text that was in his possession dated from the 12th century. Well, now wait a minute, we have manuscripts that date back to 130-ish now. He didn't have access to those. So I want you to understand that I'm in no way criticizing Erasmus's scholarship. The work he did was very good for the time and for what he had to work with. But what I am saying is, we have so much more to work with than Erasmus did. We talked about over 1,580 different, thank you. Wake up. It's too late, it's gone. Y'all are gonna, oh, it's awake, good, thank you. We have over 1,580 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament that we can go back and we can compare and contrast, many of which are so much older than the Textus Receptus that he produced. However, the Textus Receptus gained such popularity that it becomes the basis for translating the New Testament in many of the most influential English translations up until the 20th century. Okay? So, for example, in 1384, you have a man by the name of John Wycliffe who wants to bring the Bible into English. Now, 1384 is before Erasmus has compiled the Textus Receptus, right? Wycliffe makes an English translation from the Latin Vulgate. His source material is the Latin Vulgate. Anybody see a problem with that? The Latin Vulgate is itself a translation. So Wycliffe's translation, while his intent was good, no question about that. He wanted to get the Bible into the hands of the people in a language they could understand. He is making a translation of a translation. Ever played the telephone game? You know how that goes, where you sit in a circle and somebody whispers a message into one person's ear, and you go around the circle, each person whispering the message, and they try to be as faithful as they can to what they heard, but by the time you get to the end of the circle, what usually happens? The message is changed, sometimes drastically, right? Same thing sort of happens when you translate a translation, okay? And that's essentially what's happened here. So Wycliffe's translation is based on the Latin Vulgate. But then we get down to 1522, and Martin Luther is doing his work in Germany, and Martin Luther translates the New Testament into German, not English, because he was working in Germany. But instead of using the Latin Vulgate, he goes and he takes Erasmus's text, Erasmus's Greek text for the New Testament, and he translates that into German. Now that sets a precedent, because people are saying, look, this is really the only critical Greek text we've got to work with at this point in time in history. And we can take this and we can translate it into our vernacular languages, and at least we're coming from Greek into vernacular versus Greek into Latin into vernacular, and it produces a superior translation. All right? So in 1526, you have William Tyndale, who translates the Bible into English. And Tyndale also goes back and uses Erasmus's Greek text as his source material for translating the Bible into English. Now, you remember the story of Tyndale. Not only his Bible translating, but also his preaching and writing got him into hot water with both the Catholic Church and the English crown, and he wound up being burned at the stake after he was strangled. Interestingly enough, the accounts of history tell us that his last words shouted from the post where his body would be burned was, "May God open the eyes of the English king." And he was strangled and then burned at the stake. But one of the things he contributed was the translation of the Bible. And I think before he died, he got very close to translating both Old and New Testaments. I think his Old Testament translation was finished posthumously by some of his colleagues. In 1535, just 9 years later, the king had changed his position in England toward translating the Bible into English, and Miles Coverdale produces a Bible, the first printed complete Bible in English that is distributed with the blessing of the crown. Now, guess where Miles Coverdale got most of his points of comparison? Tyndale. His text is Erasmus's Greek text, but his work borrows heavily from Tyndale's translation. But Miles Coverdale produces a translation of the Bible. In 1539, 4 years later, the Great Bible is produced. And then in 1560, the Geneva Bible, a translation into English done in Geneva, Switzerland, all relying heavily on Tyndale's work, but all using for the New Testament their source material, Erasmus's Greek text of the Textus Receptus. Now, the Geneva Bible and the Great Bible were actually the Bibles that most of the founding fathers in this country would have read from. The King James translation, yes, was translated in 1611, but it didn't gain as wide acceptance as you would think early on. And it didn't gain an especially wide reception in the colonies until some years after the American Revolution. Partly because in the process of the Revolution, the King's Bible was sort of like the King's tax and the King's tea and all the other King's things. People weren't all that interested in it. And so the King James translation wasn't especially popular at that time. The King James translation uses as its Greek text Erasmus's Textus Receptus. And it also borrows heavily from Tyndale's work and the Great Bible. King James translation. If you go back and look at what the translators had to work with at the time, is an absolutely fabulous piece of work. But you have to judge it based on what's going on at the time. Okay? It is a different thing to say tonight in May 2023, is this a fabulous translation to use in preaching and teaching, versus to look at it from the lens of what kind of quality translation is this at the time it was done. And the reason those are two different questions is because the English language has changed drastically from 1611 to 2023. And as we mentioned in a previous class, if you are reading from a King James Bible, the chances are very, very slim that you actually have a reprint of the 1611 version. Because that's not the King James Bible that you'll buy at Books A Million. If you go to Books A Million and you buy a King James version, what you're going to be buying is the 1870 revision of the 1611 King James Bible. Because even by 1870, the 1611 version had become enough obsolete in terms of spoken English that it was difficult for people to read and understand. And so they revised it. They updated the English language. Okay? So truly fabulous piece of work for the time in which it was done, except for the fact that we have a much, much better group of manuscripts to compare and contrast when using to translate from Greek into English now. And the English language has moved a long way from where it was in 1611. Okay? So we get the King James version, 1769, the King James is revised. That's what I meant to say, 1769 revision. The King James is revised. In 1885, there was a committee that got together from both North America and Great Britain to produce a new English translation. And this time they decided we're not going to use the Textus Receptus. We're going to go back and we are going to use a text that has been in the works now for several decades, where scholars have been going through and cataloging and compiling as many of these old manuscripts that we've found as possible. And we are going to try and use, by comparing and contrasting these old manuscripts, what we believe to represent, from all of these put together, the most accurate Greek text that we can get. Okay? And that becomes the basis of the translation for the 1885 English Revised Version. There's only one problem. Not really a problem, but it was a problem for the translating committee. The American scholars and the British scholars in that committee had some differences of opinion on how things ought to be translated. And so in order to compromise on their differences of opinion, what they ended up deciding to do was the American scholars would wait until the turn of the century, and they would produce a translation in America that had what they wanted to do in it, but the English version would go to print first. So in 1885, the English Revised Version comes out. If you have a Johnson's Notes on the New Testament, they're based on the English Revised Version. But in 1901, the American Committee's version comes out as the American Standard Version. Highly, highly literal translation, both of the Greek and of the Hebrew. All right, we'll put a peg down there. That's a lot of information. Take that home with you. Hopefully it'll be helpful to you. We'll pick up where we left off next time. Thank you for your attention.